Rif Mountains, Morocco, 1921. Crimson mountains tower up into a brilliant blue sky as you stare through the sights of your machine gun. It is a beautiful scene which makes your current situation even more horrific. You're surrounded by the bodies of your fallen comrades, trapped in your fort by Riffian tribesmen. Everyone else is dead. It is now just you alone, with no water and barely any food. The Riffians begin their final attack as you open fire with your machine gun. These mountains may be your tomb, but you will make them pay for it. Bullets ricochet around you. One barely misses your head, while you mow down 3 tribesmen who try to charge the fort. Just when it seems like all is lost, the firing suddenly stops. The tribesmen, they're fleeing. Then you see the relief column of Spanish soldiers. It is a sight that almost makes you cry. An officer with a miraculously clean uniform approaches you, leading fresh-faced conscripts. They look at the dead bodies and destruction that surrounds you with terror. "Private, where is your commander? Where is everyone else? 200 men were garrisoning this fort." You slowly salute him and reply, "Dead. They're all dead. I am the only one still alive." The officer turns white at the news. Looking at the young conscripts, you get the feeling that more Spanish lives will be swallowed by these mountains before this war ends. I'm your host, James Barton, and welcome to Forgotten Wars.
Consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
First few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada.
Ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen?
Hello everyone. I hope 2025 is going well for you all. Proud to say we've now reached 10 episodes. Thank you to everyone who is listening or subscribing. It really means a lot to me. Today we'll be heading into the mountains of Morocco for a war that's rarely talked about outside of Spain or Morocco, yet it's one of the most fascinating conflicts I've ever come across. Generals going mad, feckless officers, whole armies being destroyed, corruption, and one of the greatest guerrilla forces in history. Morocco, one observer said, became a vast military cemetery for Spain. Out of this chaos and death would emerge a Spanish army and officer corps who would plunge Spain itself into civil war. The brutal tactics used in the Rif would be brought to the mainland with devastating results. Let's head into the mountains together. But beware, few who enter remain unchanged. When we last saw Spain, it had just been defeated in the Spanish-American War and had lost the last remnants of an empire that was once the envy of the world. Before the war, it was considered a still great, if decaying, power. Now it was relegated to second-rank status. For the institutions and elites who'd benefited from the empire, this was an intolerable state of affairs. They wanted a return to glory, a renaissance of power, for things to be as they once were in the Spanish Golden Age. Now shut out of the Caribbean and the Pacific, their eyes would turn to Africa as the last parts of this vast continent were gobbled up. It got its chance when France was taking over Morocco, just a short journey across the Mediterranean from Spain's southern coast. Britain didn't want another strong naval power in northern Morocco, as it was near to a crucial entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. As something of a bribe to Britain to allow France's conquest, northern Morocco would be given to Spain instead. a new African empire was literally dropped on Spain's lap. For the Spanish army, it offered a chance for redemption after their defeat to the Americans, and the tales of incompetence and corruption that had emerged afterwards when veterans returned home. Plus, it offered the chance of action and promotion, something that never would happen with garrison duty on the mainland. For the Catholic Church, many of its priests remembered the Reconquista of Spain from Muslim rule. They saw a new chance to spread Christianity to Morocco. For the business community, there was a prospect of iron and other minerals to feast upon in the mountains of the Rif. In one fell swoop, all those who had been humiliated by the loss of Cuba and the Philippines could be appeased. It was not quite the gift Spain assumed it would be, however. Outside of the coastal areas, it encompassed the wild Rif Mountains. Rather than Arabs, these were populated by Berbers, fierce and ancient tribesmen. They had been in North Africa for thousands of years, with their ancestors fighting both for and against ancient Carthage and Rome. They were experienced warriors and amazing shots. They could walk as much as 30 miles a night over mountain trails, and yet be perfectly fit to attack at daybreak, all while surviving on a little fruit and bread. They existed in an almost permanent state of war, battling other tribes over blood feuds and disputes. A celebrated feud began when members of one family killed a dog belonging to another, and then refused to pay the required blood money. 12 men were killed in combat on the first day alone. Each side gathered allies until hundreds of tribesmen were locked in combat with little idea of why the conflict had begun in the first place. Walter Harris, a famous journalist for the British Times newspaper, and something of an expert on the Rif, claimed that, "I have known whole families treacherously massacred at a feast for reconciliation. One sheikh was murdered by his rival and his 4 sons, while seated partaking of his hospitality in his own guest room. A volley was fired by his retainers from the door and windows, and the deed was accomplished." The Rif makes even Game of Thrones seem tame. Starting in the 1920s, the Spanish advanced into the Rif Mountains from their coastal strongholds, trying to make their rule a reality on the ground, rather than just on paper. They did not know it yet, but they were already laying the ground for the disaster that was to come. The army they deployed had learnt nothing from its defeat in the Spanish-American War. Indeed, it had gotten worse in some respects. Out of the 25,000 native Spanish troops, more than half were illiterate recruits who had been rushed into service with zero training. The officers were not much better, with 2/3 of them unable to read a map, relying instead on their cojones, meaning testicles or guts, to decide which way to go instead. Unsurprisingly, Spanish units kept getting lost. They were also poorly equipped to an astonishing degree. For example, in Melilla, the key Spanish stronghold in the Eastern Rif, 3/4 of the rifles in its arsenal were in poor or even useless condition. Barracks were run-down hellholes. Sanitation was non-existent, while the few hospitals provided were barely worthy of the name. Inevitably, sickness and disease ravaged the army. The soldiers lived on a mixture of coffee, beans, and rice, with an occasional piece of bread, or sometimes a bit of meat thrown in. As one local journalist said, the soldiers were ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-treated. The youth of Spain, courageous and patient, have been systematically deprived of almost everything to which they had a right. Meanwhile, corruption had reached truly astonishing levels. Poorly paid soldiers and their wives routinely sold their rifles and ammunition in the local marketplaces for fresh vegetables, which were then sold to the very tribesmen they were fighting. Again, the officers were even worse. They pilfered everything from the storage warehouses, just as they had done in Cuba, with some becoming incredibly rich. Funds to build roads and railways were diverted into their pockets, while the rolls of the army were filled with phantom soldiers, fake soldiers who existed only on paper, so the officers could pocket their wages. With their ill-gotten gains, they spent most of their time in Manila, gambling, whoring, and sneaking back to the mainland on leave. It may surprise you, but morale in this army was at rock bottom. While the Spanish army is in a completely rotten state, maybe they have a competent general who can turn things around, I hear you say. Sadly, they had the worst general Spain has ever produced. Major General Manuel Fernandez Silvestre. Hereafter, I'll be calling him Sylvie. A handsome, flamboyant man with a magnificent handlebar moustache, he lived up to the stereotype of the Latin lover and was a compulsive womanizer with a large brood of illegitimate children. While brave, he'd been wounded 16 times in Cuba fighting the Americans. He was also dangerously reckless and a truly terrible general. He regularly underestimated his opponents and had a particularly low opinion of the Riffians, which he frequently shared with the locals, not exactly endearing himself to them. While he was actually the second in command of the Spanish forces in the Rif, the commander-in-chief was actually General Berengue. He was a personal friend of the King of Spain, which gave him an edge over his supposed commander. Berengue was very worried that one nasty letter to the king from Sylvie could destroy his career. In practice, Sylvie was allowed to pretty much do as he wanted, with fatal results. If Spain's leadership left little to be desired, the same could not be said for the Riffians, as they began to fight back. Soon, the name of Abd el-Krim would become famous around the world. Ironically, el-Krim had actually been something of an ally and collaborator with the Spanish to start off with. He'd been fast-tracked by the authorities into a number of important positions, and had been trained as a mine assessor to help exploit the natural resources of the Rif. Both his family and himself were doing well out of their Spanish connections. However, while editor of a local Arabic newspaper, he criticised the French occupation of Morocco. The French complained to the Spanish, who imprisoned him. As so often happens with empires, they ended up creating their worst enemy. El-Krim emerged a changed man, hardened, radicalised, seemingly only interested in driving Spain from his homeland. As Sylvie began advancing into the Rif, El-Krim, for now, let him win easy victories. His plan was to let the arrogant and reckless general advance deep into the mountains, to overstretch his supply lines, and then the trap would be sprung. To Sylvie, however, the rapid progress he was making showed both his own skill as a general and how pathetic the Riffian tribes really were. At a meeting with his supposed superior, General Berengue, his arrogance and ego was on full display. Imagine this in your mind's eye. You are an aide to General Berengue as he waits for General Silvestre to arrive for their meeting. The general is already an hour late, and Berengue is becoming annoyed. You sneak out to find him, only to see Sylvie chatting up a blushing young secretary. Typical. He is very annoyed as you interrupt his latest romance. But finally, you usher him into the room. Soon he is boasting of his rapid successes in the Rif, that the Riffians are cowards who just needed a kick in the pants from a real man. Berengue seems impressed, but warns him that the tribesmen are tough warriors, experts in ambushes and fighting in the mountains. Sylvie throws back his head and laughs heartedly. Ha ha ha! His response chills you to the bone. There will be little resistance, I assure you. I will make them tremble. The only way to succeed in Morocco is to cut off the heads of all the Moors. Berengar seems satisfied, but Sylvie's arrogance worries you. The mountains of the Rif are famous for swallowing up armies after all. Well, if the worst happens, you may have a chance with that pretty secretary after all. Sylvie continued to make mistakes as he plunged deeper and deeper into the Rif. He wasn't bothering to make sure the territory he'd overrun was actually secured, while his supply lines were stretched and unprotected. To be fair, he had built 144 fortifications, but even with these, the incompetence of Sylvie and his aides had left them extremely vulnerable. These consisted of blockhouses, small fortifications with only 1 or 2 rooms, garrisoned by about 12 men, right up to large forts with thousands of defenders. The blockhouses in particular were awful. They lacked any sort of toilet, and soldiers who ventured out of the filthy bunkers to relieve themselves were often shot by lurking tribesmen. All the fortifications were stationed miles away from the nearest water sources for some reason. They had barely any provisions and would be easy to surround and cut off if anything went wrong. They would become tombs for most of the Spanish soldiers stationed in them. His army may be badly armed, badly led, badly supplied, and based in terrible fortifications, but in one thing they were well supplied: prostitutes. In true Sylvie style, a huge army of prostitutes was also marching with the army to see to the needs of the men. And let's face it, probably Sylvie himself. El Krim now warned the Spanish that if they crossed the Amacran River, then their army would be destroyed. Sylvie responded with typical bravado. This man, Abed El Krim, is crazy. I'm not going to take seriously the threats of a little Berber judge whom I had at my mercy a short time ago. His insolence merits a new punishment. As he crossed the Amacran, the trap began to close around him. Armed Riffians began attacking his overstretched supply lines. In the village of Abaran, his native troops, called regulars, mutinied. They killed most of their Spanish officers, beheading them, and joined the rebels. Soon a general uprising was occurring all over the Rif. An alarmed Berengar rushed to see Sylvie, suggesting he suspend the offensive until he was ready to support him with more troops. The discussion became so heated that Sylvie tried to wring his commanding general's neck and had to be dragged off by his aides. Then Berengar had to be restrained as he reached for his own pistol. Sylvie threatened to write to the king if he wasn't allowed to continue his offensive. He was begged not to advance any further, but Berengar refused to directly order him to stop. Then his friend, King Alfonso of Spain, sent him a personal message celebrating his victories. "Hooray for real men," wrote the king. There was now no chance that Sylvie would stop his advance. He would never want to earn the disapproval of his friend the king. The Spanish continued to advance to a village called Igraben and built a large fort. Now El Krim finally closed the trap on Sylvie's army. A proclamation went round the Rif claiming, "The Spaniards have already lost the game. Look at Abaran. They have left their dead, mutilated and unburied, their souls vaguely wandering, tragically denied the delights of paradise." The Riffians smelt blood in the water and flocked to El Karim's side. Soon, the new fort was surrounded by thousands of tribesmen and was being bombarded by artillery they had captured from the Spanish. It was a desperate situation. Their only water source was 3 miles away at the big Spanish fort at Anwal. The soldiers were reduced to drinking the juice from pimento and tomato cans, then sweetened vinegar and ink, and finally their own urine. Anwal sent one relief column through the narrow gorge separating them from their besieged comrades. It was cut to pieces by Riffian snipers and returned having lost 152 dead. Sylvie now arrived and took command at Anwar, finally realizing the danger they were in. A further 3,000 men were sent to relieve the fort. Only 10 survivors returned. Finally, Sylvie ordered the garrison to surrender. When their commander refused, he then ordered them to make a break for it. Most of them were hacked to death as they tried to fight their way out. Only 11 men reached the safety of Anwar. 9 of those died in the next few hours from exhaustion and heat stroke. It was becoming a bloodbath for the Spanish army, but the worst was yet to come. The victorious tribesmen now surrounded Anwar. As disaster followed disaster, Sylvie seemed to break under the pressure. He began chewing his moustache, mumbling to himself. One of his eyes developed a twitch, and he fell into despair. He claimed to his officers that they were outnumbered, which was false, almost out of ammunition, also false, and that to stay at the fort was certain death. Probably true, though the alternative was hardly any better, as we'll see. He ordered a retreat, yet refused to let his officers tell the soldiers, or make any attempt to organise it. If he had properly organised the retreat, some of the army could have survived. Instead, he turned it into a massacre. Let us head to the fall of Anwar, the worst defeat in Spanish military history. You are an aide to General Silvestre, and are standing next to him on the parapet of the fort as you prepare for the retreat. The sun beats down relentlessly on the Spanish garrison as it prepares to flee from Anwar. The soldiers are anxious and confused. They were told at the last minute that a retreat would occur today. The stench of fear and madness pervades the entire fort. The general's mind seems to have gone. He stares blankly ahead while chewing his moustache. You ask him, will he give the order to leave the fort? He doesn't answer, just mumbling under his breath. In the absence of an order, someone decides to open the fort door, and the first soldiers tentatively march out. Suddenly, a great chant of Allahu Akbar echoes from the heights around the fort, and gunshots ring out. The soldiers are terrified. Many fall dead where they stand. The retreat is already breaking down into chaos. That awful chant echoes around the fort. General Silvestre, are you not going to do something? Your men need their general. You shout at the mumbling man to your side. Your words finally seem to penetrate through his funk. He smiles weirdly at you. Then, to your horror, he shouts to the panicking soldiers below, "Run! Run! The bogeyman is coming!" And then breaks out in cackling laughter. The effect is disastrous as soldiers throw away their rifles and all order breaks down. The retreat is now just a frightened mob of men trying to escape. The Riffians emerge from their hiding spots, smiling. They start picking off the Spanish soldiers as if they were a shooting party hunting animals. The road is now a mix of frightened men, bullets, dust, and the screams of the wounded. Further ahead, you can see more Riffians racing down the mountains with knives and swords to attack the fleeing Spanish soldiers. It is a monstrous sight. The general stands there giggling. You slap him and shout, "Come to your senses, man!" Still giggling, he pulls out his pistol. "The bogeyman is coming," he yells as he raises it to his head. The Riffians break into the fort. It really is all over now. You raise your rifle, determined to go down with honour. Almost the whole army was killed, 4,000 men in total. Sylvie's head was cut off and paraded through every village in the Rif. Ironically, El Krim's army had almost run out of ammunition, but now it had captured a treasure trove of supplies from Sylvie's defeated army. 11,000 rifles, 60 machine guns, 2,000 horses, 100 cannons, and an almost unlimited supply of ammunition. So great was the haul that El Krim boasted that, in just one night, Spain supplied us with all the equipment which we needed to carry on a big war. There was some heroism during the fall of Anual, however. I said almost the entire army was destroyed. One cavalry unit broke through the Riffian ranks and escaped. They were soon to go down in legend as the Alcantara Regiment. We will hear more of them a little further in our story. As awful as the fall of Anual was for Spain, it was just the beginning. Those blockhouses we spoke of before were now sitting ducks, with their general dead and the main part of their force destroyed. All the mistakes of the past came back to haunt the Spanish troops. They were under-provisioned, miles away from water sources. Their Moroccan regulars, who'd been treated with contempt, were now defecting to El Krim, and they now faced an enemy armed with their own artillery. One by one, they started abandoning their fortifications, desperately trying to reach safety as the whole Spanish position in the eastern Rif collapsed. Those that tried to flee took heavy casualties. The 500 men of the Sidi Driss garrison tried to fight their way to a nearby beach to be rescued by the navy. Less than a dozen made it to the safety of the ships. At Zoco el Talata del Matasa, the Spanish soldiers fled towards the relative safety of the French occupation zone. Only a third of them would make it. Surrendering wasn't a better option either. At Dar Qubana, an entire garrison was beheaded after surrendering to El Krim's forces. In the chaos and bloodshed of the retreat, Sylvie's second-in-command, General Navarro, desperately sought to maintain order and save as many as he could. Leading a force of 3,000 soldiers he had managed to wrangle together, he led them on a fighting retreat to the fortified village of Monte Urut. It is here that the Alcantara unit re-enters the picture. They were instrumental in keeping the Riffians at bay, launching charge after charge to allow their fellow soldiers time to escape. Then the army came to a river it would need to cross to get to safety. However, the tribesmen were hot on their heels. General Navarro ordered them to delay the tribesmen. It was essentially a suicide mission. Their commander gave a now famous speech. "Soldiers, the time for sacrifice has come. Let everyone do their duty. If you don't, your mothers, your girlfriends, all the Spanish women will say that we are cowards. We are going to prove that we are not. Viva España! 4 times they charged the Riffians. By the end, they were fighting on foot and going hand to hand with them. Out of 700 men that made up the regiment, only 70 survived. They achieved their mission, however. The army successfully crossed the river and made it to Monte Arut. However, the march had taken its toll, and his troops were exhausted. Unable to go further, they were soon surrounded by El Karim's men. With no medical supplies available, hundreds died of heatstroke and gangrene. Once again, the base had been constructed with no thought of access to water sources. The main one was over a mile away. Spanish airplanes tried to drop supplies to the besieged garrison, including large blocks of ice, but the pilots were terrible at aiming. Most of the supplies landed well outside the town and were eagerly picked up by the delighted tribesmen of El Karim. In fact, they used to cheer and wave at the Spanish planes for the goodies they were delivering. When no relief army arrived, Navarro was forced to surrender. What happened next is one of the most horrific chapters of the Rif War. Despite being ordered by El Karim to treat the prisoners well, over 2,000 were then massacred in cold blood. The remaining 600, mostly officers, and including Navarro himself, were kept alive so they could be ransomed. Few would ever return to Spain. Abd El Karim had won an extraordinary victory. With just 5,000 tribesmen, he had utterly wiped out a modern, well-armed, professional European army of over 20,000 men. He and his men were now lords of the Rif Mountains, swimming in a vast haul of booty they had captured from the Spanish. Now, the road to Melilla seemed open as well. Could he drive the Spanish completely from the eastern Rif? Anything seemed possible at this moment. While General Berenguer had arrived with reinforcements, he was struggling to build up the defences of Melilla. His biggest problem was that the soldiers he expected to find garrisoning the city seemed to have disappeared, if they'd ever existed at all. Most of the garrison turned out to be the phantom soldiers I mentioned earlier, only existing on paper to enrich corrupt officers. The rest had snuck home to Spain on leave. Apart from his experienced reinforcements, the only troops he had were clerks, cooks, and those who had barely been trained. The atmosphere in the city was one of terror and fear as the Riffians opened up with their artillery. Come walk with me through the streets of a city on the brink of falling. You are a clerk in the Spanish army at Melilla. At least you were. Now you carry a rifle, darting through the streets of the city, trying to dodge the shells fired by the Riffians. Your mission is to head to a local bar, where some of the soldiers and officers who were meant to be garrisoning the city are reportedly hiding. Everyone is needed for the upcoming battle. You remember the general's face when you told him most of the soldiers on the payroll didn't actually exist. One of them was even named after a top officer's pet cat. Sadly, that answer got you stuck with this duty. As you enter the bar, you can hear drunken singing coming from the cellar. You trudge down the narrow steps. The stench of wine is overpowering. You find 4 officers are getting wildly drunk, drinking straight from the barrel, while a 5th lays unconscious on the floor. At least you hope he's just unconscious. Officers, I bring orders from the general. Report to the front lines at once. One of them sneers. Who cares anymore? All is lost. The Moors will be here soon and cut all our throats. Get out of here, little private. Then you hear footsteps coming down the stairs. You both look up and your faces turn white. Down comes a group of armed tercios, legionaries of the Spanish Foreign Legion, the best of the best, and the most brutal unit in the Spanish army. Their leader stares at the officers with barely disguised disgust. Then, in a quiet but deadly voice, he says, "You're a disgrace to the uniform. My men will sober you up, and then it's to the front lines." The officer looks terrified, but blusters, "Who are you to order us about?" "I am Major Francisco Franco. The future dictator of Spain enters our story. At this time, he was second in command of the most feared unit in the Spanish army, the Spanish Foreign Legion, nicknamed the Tercios after the near-invincible units Spain deployed in the 30 Years' War. It was similar to the French Foreign Legion. However, it was mostly Spanish due to the harsh discipline it imposed. Its founder was one of the craziest men in military history, José Torreros. Famous for his bravery under fire, he also had a creepy and morbid obsession with death. His new legion's motto would be "Viva la Muerte," or "Long Live Death," while their anthem was called "The Betrothed of Death." But he was real fun at parties. By the end of the Rif War, Torreros had lost an arm, an eye, one of his legs, and most of his fingers on his remaining hand. Today he is remembered in Spain as the glorious mutilated one. Quite appropriately, really. The Tercios would not get an all-out battle this time, though. While Melilla appeared to be at the tribesmen's mercy, El Crim did not attack. Just as Hannibal, after his famous victory at Cannae, didn't march on Rome, El Crim would not march on Melilla. He would later call it his biggest mistake. He would never get a better chance to wipe out the Spanish position in the Eastern Rif. Why didn't he attack? He would later claim that it was due to the large number of Europeans living in Melilla, and he was fearful it would lead to further foreign intervention. Probably the real reason, though, was that his army was already beginning to disintegrate. Despite being a formidable force, it also had the weaknesses of being a tribal army and not a professional military. The tribesmen had won enough victories, slit enough Spanish throats, taken enough loot, and now they wanted to go home and harvest their crops. The terrified Spanish got their reprieve and recovered their courage. They emerged from Melilla and slowly began recovering the territory they had lost, relying heavily on the Tercios to do most of the fighting. As they progressed, they encountered the devastation and wreckage of their previous defeat. Recapturing Monte Arut, the site of the previous massacre of Spanish prisoners, they found it resembled an abattoir. The Times journalist Harris wrote that everywhere were ruins and unburied corpses. Before Monte Arut could be occupied, whole days were spent in getting rid of the dead and purifying the wells. Surely the King of Spain, who had so favoured his friend Sylvie and supported his aggressive approach in the Rif, must have been devastated by such a loss of life. If your answer was yes, I am afraid you were mistaken. Let's head to the south of France, where His Majesty King Alfonso is currently on a golfing holiday. You're a young Spanish officer assigned to break the bad news to King Alfonso about the defeat in the Rif. You are worried for your own career. Would the king be so upset that you could damage your own chances for promotion? Worse yet, could you be shipped out to some Moroccan mountain? You walk across the golf course as the king practices his swing to admiring murmurs from his flatterers, flunkies, and hangers-on. He doesn't see you at first. You nervously clear your throat to get his attention. Your Majesty, I bring grave news. There has been a disaster in Morocco. The army of General Silvestre has been destroyed by the tribesmen. Many are dead, including the general himself. My condolences, Your Majesty. You wait for his reaction, but to your surprise, he doesn't seem bothered at all. He waves a disinterested hand at you and says, "Chicken meat is cheap." Then he turns to his cronies and says, "Now watch this drive. Quattro!" You stare at him, stunned, as his cronies start praising his shot. The soldiers who just died fought for their king and country, yet he sees them as nothing but cannon fodder? The king's response would become public and would do much to undermine the monarchy, leading to its fall in the early 1930s. The king may have been blasé about the disaster, but the rest of Spain certainly wasn't. One deputy in the Spanish parliament, the Cortes, shouted that, "If we continue like this, we shall soon find that we have no Morocco, no army, and no Spain." While another cried that, "We are in the most acute period of the decline of Spain. The campaign in Africa is a total, absolute failure of the Spanish army without extenuation." The government fell, with a new Prime Minister announcing that everywhere there is the same misgovernment and the same laxity. A divide began to open up in Spanish society between those who wanted to stay and win in Morocco, the Africanistas, and those who wanted to abandon the war completely, the abandonistas. In the Rif, El Karim's influence was almost at its height. A new Republic of the Rif was created. It had a semi-representative assembly that supposedly governed the new nation. However, the real power was all in El Karim's hands. He made some small reforms, like establishing a rough-and-ready telephone system and buying some hopelessly out-of-date aircraft as an air force. But most of all, he prepared for the next phase of the war with Spain. A new Spanish general now took over in the east, Ricardo Baguite, commanding a force of now over 150,000 soldiers. Yet despite this numerical advantage, the war now entered a stalemate. The army's size seemed impressive, yet most were ill-trained and ill-motivated conscripts that were only fit for garrison duty in the safety of the coastal areas. The actual fighting now was mostly done by the tercios and the newly recreated native Moroccan regulars. In this one area, Spain seemed to have learned their lesson. Regulars were now much better treated, and were selected from tribes that were traditional rivals of El Karim's. For good or ill, Spain was learning the old British trick of divide and rule. It was these shock troops that were slowly retaking territory from the tribesmen, in spite of tremendously high casualties. On more than one occasion, a battalion of the tercios or the regulars would lose in just a single action as much as 3/4 of their effective strength. Being a native Spanish officer in the regular units was particularly deadly. The Moroccan troops refused to go into battle unless their officers led from the front, leading to an over 50% casualty rate for the officers. Thanks to the tercios and the regulars, Spain seemed to have recaptured most of the territory it had lost after Annual. Yet in reality, garrisons only controlled the very ground they stood on. They were constantly attacked and sniped at by El Karim's tribesmen, while the Rifians showed how adaptable they could be against the modern weaponry Spain was beginning to deploy. they sank a Spanish warship, the Juan de Juanes, in Aluhumas Bay, El Crim's key stronghold, using batteries captured from the Spanish. This forced the Spanish to abandon their attempts to blockade this part of the coast. Then Spain deployed armoured cars, at the time among the latest technology available. At first they terrified the tribesmen and allowed the Spanish to win some easy victories. However, the Riffians soon worked out how to disable them. Let's join the Riffians to see how they used to do this. Your heart pounds against your chest as the armoured cars spot your force and open fire. You have new tactics to beat these machines of the devil, but will they work? Half your force keeps the armoured cars occupied, many falling dead or wounded from their guns. You drop to the floor with the others, waiting as the cars lumber closer and closer to you. Here goes nothing. You leap up as the nearest car has almost passed you by and start firing your rifle through one of the gun ports. You catch an image of a shocked Spanish soldier's face staring at you, but the rest is a blur as you keep firing. With the crew busy, other tribesmen set fire to its gasoline tank. As it starts to burn, you quickly back away. Soon a roaring fire engulfs the whole car. One by one, the other armoured cars are set ablaze, their crews unable to get out. It worked! Now you have nothing to fear from these metal monsters. By November 1922, he had established a large outpost on a mountaintop in Tizi Azza. Once again it was miles away from a water source, while supplies could only arrive through another of those deadly, narrow gorges that were perfect for ambushes. The inevitable happened. The Riffian guerrillas surrounded the outpost, firing from the boulder-strewn summits and higher slopes of the rocky passes around Tizi Azza, down upon the Spanish. 2,000 Spanish soldiers died. The rest were besieged for 6 months. Supplies could only be brought in by the tercios fighting their way through the gorge, sometimes going hand to hand with the tribesmen. A shocked Spanish public recoiled from yet another horrific loss of life. Any further advances into the Rif were cancelled for now. Baguette did successfully secure the release of the prisoners taken at Monteyrut, however, paying a huge ransom of $400,000. Of the 600 prisoners taken, only 325 had survived. As the war dragged on, the political system back in Spain began to buckle under the strain. Army units en route to Morocco mutinied, while others refused to board troop ships in Malaga. Left-wing mobs cheered for the new Republic of the Rif and jeered the Spanish flag. Out of the chaos came an end to Spain's fragile democracy, as army units seized control of the government in a coup. The time of Spain's new dictator, Primo de Rivera, had arrived. In our next episode, Spain suffers more heartache and tragedy, while France enters the conflict. Out of the chaos and bloodshed, Spain will declare a total war to break the Riffian resistance once and for all. I've recently been in contact with another new podcaster, Skylar, at the Weekly Dive podcast. A cool guy covering some interesting subjects. Here is a promo for his podcast.
Hey everyone, my name is Skylar Taylor, and I'm the host of The Weekly Dive, a podcast all about niche stories, mysterious events, and adventurous lives throughout history, culture, and travel. Unlike other podcasts, I'm not a historian or journalist. I'm just a college student learning about topics that strike my interest. Join me each week, and together we will experience the funniest and jaw-dropping stories left in the shadows. If you want to learn about massive whiskey floods, Napoleon's battle against bunnies, or a bear that fought in World War II, then check out The Weekly Dive on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, or tell a friend. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.